what I'd like to do is to capture your personal recollections of life before the NHS. And I probably, I don't know if it's fair to say, but you have an experience of life before the NHS, and you probably may wish to quantify that at some point to give it some some accuracy. But I think it's a fascinating opportunity to listen to what does that actually mean in terms of the lived experience. So over to you.
Yeah, of course, not only before the NHS, you could say almost before the welfare state. We had a kind of residual welfare state brought in by the Liberal government under Lloyd George in 1901. And of course, it was criticised, and it was criticised for being too much like the Prussians, because what people may not realise, that from the 1880s to 1945, that's Bismarck to Hitler, the average working class person in Germany had a whole range of social services which we simply did not have. Health services were mainly based on a very haphazard form of charity, sometimes local authority, sometimes trade unions, some religious groups and so on, and invariably you had to pay. And the world was pretty grim until the Second World War, when people said there must be a change. And then there's this wonderful word, the Beveridge Report. Now, okay, when I first came to Bournemouth in 1950, I was 14 years old, so you can guess how old I am. When I first heard the Beveridge Report, I thought it was something about tea, but in fact it talked about 5 giants. And let me tell you what the giants were. First, there was poverty. Poverty of an incredible level, because the wage of people was almost at subsistence level and so on. If people were ill, there were no backups. And if you were poor and you had no money, you were then sent to the workhouse. And the workhouses were terrible places, indeed designed to punish and deter the undeserving poor. And they had a system. You didn't go, if you did have a couple, they separated them. I remember my own daughter did when she was a school child, she did analysis of some of the local church records in North Leeds. And she came home crying, Daddy, there was this Mr. and Mrs. Smith, age 70, and they'd separated them. But the thing about age 70, very few people got to age 70. But thanks to Lloyd George, there was 5 shillings old age pension. But very few working people ever lived to 70. And do you know what 5 shillings meant to live on? In today's money, that would be, in today's money, would be £48. Could you live on £48? Then, of course, there was ignorance about education. We left school at 14. Now, I remember very well, I was allowed to wear long trousers at 14. You couldn't wear long trousers until you're 14. Now, I'll tell you, that scared me, because I thought, who's going to pay me? Because when I came to 14, luckily, they brought in age 15 to leave school. As you know, I had a rather turbulent adolescence and everything else, and I left school at 15. And that meant you had to be responsible for your own living. Can you imagine? And of course, education, in a sense, was so limited for the average working class family. And I'll give you an example. As I say, I left school at 15 because I had turbulent adolescence, parents had died, and it was all a bit of a mess. But I came back to education in my early 20s, like some of our students, indeed. But I remember meeting a friend of mine who was equally as intelligent, if not more intelligent than me, a superb athlete, a lad called Tommy Jarvis. And I've told you the story before, but Tommy Jarvis helped me to play cricket better. And of course, cricket was my religion. And I remember meeting Tommy, going back to Castleford, my hometown. And we said, "Oh, Tommy, what's he doing?" And of course, Tommy was a cutter in the mines. And he said, "I'm earning £30 a week. And what's that doing?" I says, "I'm a psychiatric social worker." "That's a what? What kind of job's that for a bloke?" Men would not look at jobs like that. So a few years later, I saw him. "How are you, Tommy?" Now, Tommy's a bit overweight, bit of a cough, my age, of course. Buy him a pint, still a miner, still cutting coal. "What's that doing, Colin?" "Oh, I'm a lecturer at Leeds University." "A lecturer? Bloody hell, the mum be hard up." Then it was sad. Some years later, there's Tommy. He's looking old enough to be my father, overweight, gasping, not just with the cigarettes, etc. "What's they doing then, Tommy?" "Oh, I'm working on the top." So they didn't sack him when their health was wrecked. They gave them a simple job on the top. And that was almost an insult, to work on the top, not in the mines, because that's what men did. "What are you doing, Colin?" I said, "Oh, I'm a professor at Southampton University." I thought he would go. He looked at me and said, "I'm right pleased for the kid. I'm right pleased for the..." This was the problem with education. People had no aspiration. When education came, this was the problem. And you know, that's still one of the problems. Still one of the problems. The other issue, of course, was squalor, housing. We didn't, well, most people didn't have a toilet in the house. You'd go down the yard. You know, that's how it was. And housing was bathrooms. Well, on Friday nights, this is no exaggeration, on Friday nights you'd hear boom, 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 as you'd go outside, or your man would go outside, and on a hook on the back wall by the back door would be a bath, a galvanized bath. That bath would be taken down, put in front of the fire. There'd be water in it. The youngest would get in first, so my brother get in the first bath, then I'd get in. I didn't have a bath on my own until, in fact, my father moved into a firm's house, and in a school of 500 lads at Temple Street, I was the only boy with a purpose-built bathroom in 1946. And I say, I didn't have a bath until we had a bathroom. Later on, of course, housing was such, and of course you'd have the war and so on. So one of the other side of the problems was elderly relatives. So we had two granddads living with us. So one lived on the couch downstairs because he couldn't walk up the stairs, and the other one shared our bedroom, and I shared a bed with my brother until I was 15. When there was family problems with some of the other families, what would happen is, I'm thinking of the Barley family, I now realise it was domestic violence. We would take in the three Barley boys, and there'd be five of us, top and tailing in a bed. And that was seen as normal. You know, it was just as simple as that. You then got a situation of disease. Hospitals, as I say, were fragmented, to say the least. And Aneurin Bevan wrote a white paper called "In Place of Fear." And what he said was, particularly working class women, are afraid to go to the doctors because they can't afford it. So then develop diseases which might have been manageable, and they die. So what Aneurin Bevan said, we'll have in place of fear, a total NHS for health and social care. I want to emphasize that. I could impeach the Thatcher government because she actually broke the link between health and social care. And through a statutory instrument in Parliament in 1982, she uncoupled health and social care. So now people pay for social care. It was never intended in the Health Act. Unfortunately, the Labour government, the Labour opposition at the time, were too incompetent to recognise what they'd done. And what did this mean? I mean, before this, in a way, you've got to think about the squalor. I talked about going down the yard. You do realise in those days that every family bought a newspaper. Every family needed a newspaper. Do you know why? Well, I'll tell you. Half of the newspaper next morning was to make the fire, and the other half was cut into squares, a hole in the middle with string at the end, and you'd have the string of newspaper on the back door. So when we first went on holiday, when they opened up the western coast during the war in 1945, to go to Blackpool, I went to a boarding house, and we knew it was posh. You got a spoon and a fork to eat your pudding, and there was something like a toilet roll. Richard, I hadn't seen a toilet roll. We'd always used the newspaper, as everybody did. I mean, you know, that was what it was. And, you know, I say we shared beds and things like this and so forth. Less amusing was children died. Again, I'm looking backwards now, but I had a series of boils, which are sores which become infected and become like pustules, and sometimes as big as a tomato. And you have a series of boils because, of course, you know, you're undernourished, poor diet, etc., etc. And I was ill when I was age 11, and I was very ill. And I realised, looking back now, I had delirium. And my mum just sat at my side of my bed, crying. That was my memory. And I was just seeing spirits and weird animals and things like that, and so on and so forth. And I knew I was very hot and so on, because I could have well died. Because, no exaggeration, my schoolfellows died once a month. It was not uncommon. Not uncommon. That's how it was. Children died. And of course, the most graphic way of understanding what the world was before the NHS, what families did, you could join a kind of, it was called clubs. And our local GP, you could join their club. And that was, my dad would pay 6pence each for him and my mother, and 3pence each for Malcolm and I, 1 and 6 a week, which meant that if you needed the doctor, you had half price consultation, that was 7 and 6, and half price medicines. So it was an investment. So we were on Dr. Pagnell's club. And this was quite remarkable. And just near the end of the war, my younger brother, who'd been ill 2 or 3 times, on 2 occasions, my mother had got the Methodist minister in, because we thought Malcolm was going to die. And indeed, on one particular occasion, I now realise he really clearly was dying. And Dr. Pagnell had a former student colleague working in the military hospital at Pontefract, and she heard about these new things, which were top secret, just for the military, called sulfonamides, a kind of early antibiotic. And she went up there and got them. And we had to pay for them, of course. God knows how much it cost. Well, I'll tell you in a minute. Gave it to Malcolm. Malcolm was walking around the next day. It was quite remarkable what antibiotics did. I had some antibiotics a few years later with boils, and the boils disappeared in 2 days. I mean, it was just quite remarkable. But those sulfonamides, we got them in 1944, I think it was. My dad paid off the doctor's bill in 1950. Because in between times, my mother became ill. She'd hurt her foot, which began to ulcerate. And she went to the doctors on the club. And of course, she only had to pay 3 and 6, which is something like 15% of my dad's wage. And the doctor said, well, look, you know, you've got an infection, get Sloan's liniment, which is a kind of antiseptic, and that'll help you and perhaps ease the pain. But if any problems, come back. And of course, my mother took the Sloan's liniment, and it didn't get any better, but she didn't go to the doctors. And at 32, my last memory of my mum was being given a hug, and I suddenly realised she smelled differently. I just wondered what it was. I now realise that it triggered diabetes. Suddenly she became acutely ill and died within 3 days. At the time, of course, we were shattered. What do you think, and so forth. And looking back, I now realise what my mother was like, almost the epitome of Nye Bevans in place of fear. Because during the war, you know, most people will eat at a meal what we had a meat ration for a week. This is no exaggeration. You know, you had one rasher of bacon, you know, not 4 or 5 slices, etc. But of course, what working class women did in those days, they fed their man, because, you know, the man had to go to work. So you fed the man, then you fed the children. Then if there's anything left, you fed yourselves. And what was remarkable is that during the war years, we working class children were the very first working class children to have vitamin C throughout the whole winter, and not just seasonal, because we had orange juice and cod liver oil. Indeed, when you got to 14, you said you're too old for orange juice and not old enough for beer. So almost without exception, most of my mates, lads of my age, became taller than their fathers. But before the NHS, sickness, you know, people were genuinely old. And can you imagine, I've had 2 hip replacements on the NHS. 17 years ago, blimey, it's 17 years ago. I had 2 major operations for cancer, 6 months chemotherapy, various other follow-up things. I've got a pacemaker now. And when I was in America and they were saying how bad your NHS is, and is it true that people have to go to a committee to see who lives and dies? So they didn't want to talk about child abuse, which I was giving a paper on. They wanted to talk about the NHS, because you talk about fake news from Bush. I mean, the Republicans always gave that kind of crap. Pardon the expression. That's a very academic word, meaning, no, I won't say what it means. And I had to say, well, no, I explained I'd had all these operations and things. They said, well, how much did it cost you? I said, well, actually, my family were a little bit disappointed, because in your money, it cost $100 for car parking fees when they were visiting me. And of course, there was an aghast, and of course, the Americans are not known for their irony. The NHS is the greatest act of social democratic legislation. And of course, people rightly revere it and love it. But let me give you some facts. And this is not being political. I remember so well, because of course my mum had died. My mum had died before the NHS. And there was this Clem Attlee and this Nairn Bevan. Now think about Nairn Bevan. Later on, it turned out it was my father-in-law's greatest moment, when he and a group of miners, along with Councillor Bevan, went to Diga workhouse to expose the cruelties and the abuse to elderly people in our workhouses. So suddenly I was interested in the NHS, you know, because working class men talked politics and policy. And I couldn't understand that our great hero, Mr. Churchill, was saying this is a form of neo-fascism. It's kind of Nazis. And they fought the NHS tooth and nail and encouraged the doctors not to go in, because you'll be directed by bureaucrats and everything else. They fought it against tooth and nail. Now, you'll hear all sorts of things talked about the NHS. Let me give you some facts based on World Bank data. Not fake news, but World Bank data. When you hear ministers talking about they're giving, for example, before the pandemic last year, they're going to say we're going to give 1.8 billion to the NHS. Now that's a lot. That sounds a lot of money to you and I, but my local hospital, which is a teaching hospital, Southampton General, of which I'm a member of, our budget last year was 0.7 billion, 700 million. 700 million. So that 1.8 billion will not go very far across 140 health authorities. The other thing is, the only real way to measure how much a nation is giving to its health is proportionally, what of its gross domestic product does it give? We've got data from 1980 to 2016. On average, the whole period, the Americans spent 13.1 and we spent 7.6, almost half as much as our national wealth. And if you look over the intervening years, most countries have spent more and more and more. For example, we now spend 9.6% and we're only 15th out of 21. But if you then look at intervening years, on some years, they actually reduced the GDP spending on health. The only years it did it was 1983, 1984, 1987, under Mrs. Thatcher, under 91 and 97, under the nice Mr. Major. And though this government, under Mr. Cameron and Mr. Johnson, has increased it twice, they've also reduced it once. So from the high point of 2014, they've reduced it down in 2015. So in fact, we get our NHS on the cheap. I have a colleague, a management colleague, and perhaps I shouldn't say this. As you know, Richard, I'm not a very good manager. I'm not really, as a frontline worker, perhaps I'm not very managerially organised. And he and I, though we're friends, we've argued like mad for the NHS. And he makes certain criticisms of the NHS, which he might be better qualified to say. So, but Colin, I have to agree with you. The one reason why the NHS works is because, like your daughter, the frontline NHS staff put patients first. And when I go to my Department of Psychiatry once a week, or do it online, I see my young colleagues nearly on their knees. But they're still there because their NHS is for their patients. And you and I, along with Professor Sam Porter, did a paper, came out early this month, where we challenged President Trump, said, OK, Mr. Trump, you wouldn't have the NHS given to you on a plate. That's a straight quote. If America, with its vast money, 17.1% of its GDP, out of every $100 it spends $17 on health, we spend $9.60. If they had the same death rate as the United Kingdom, there'd be 488,453 fewer dead Americans. One thing we can say without doubt, we all love our NHS, but we must understand it, look at the numbers, and hold every government that we should really be aiming at the European average. And then we wouldn't be having winter shortages, which we've almost taken for granted. God bless the NHS.
Hear, hear, Colin. Hear, hear.